complicated, you know, man. It's like a dang old Rubik's Cube, man. You like talking about that blue, red, man, then you get to one side and like messed
All right, Val. Welcome to the Jay Burden Show. How are you doing, man?
Hey Jay, how's it going? I'm doing well.
Yeah, thanks for agreeing to come on. For those who don't know, I just had some scheduling conflicts, and so I was left without a guest. And Val very graciously swooped in to save me. And so this is a last minute one, but I'm excited for it.
Yeah, a last minute one. I'm burdening Jay as a last minute guest. It sounds like we filled out your schedule for the next
Yeah,
month or
really.
so.
And that's not something I'm going to complain about. So anyway, for those who aren't familiar with your work, can you kind of describe who are you and what your work is like?
Yeah, so I'm sure no one is familiar with my work. I've got a very small following, or a humble one at least, and I am a hobbyist writer on Substack. I spend too much time on Twitter. I'm a Christian, a Catholic, husband and father, and yeah, I just follow dissident right spaces as, like I said, kind of a hobby and a passion project. I've got a few Substack articles that anybody could check out if they feel so inclined. A couple about the riots of 2020, a couple about the uh, different dynamics on the dissident right when it comes to urban versus rural divides and kind of what makes us similar or different. And yeah, my most recent one is about Evelyn Waugh and the nature of nostalgia and dread.
So I will say, maybe it doesn't come across in my content, but my like a primary interest academically is literature, and I love Evelyn Waugh as a writer. Uh, so it's interesting to read a Substack post on it. So before we get into your work more directly, I'm curious, right? How did you end up on this side of things? Because this is kind of an odd corner of the internet.
Yeah, that's a great question. I was always a little bit of an oddball, not very much a sensible centrist. Uh, Ever since probably middle school, I was kind of branching out and trying to like put on different hats. Spent a lot of time in high school and college, kind of trying to drill down to the core of things and figure out what. Uh, it's so funny. In these spaces, there's lots of talk about kind of like shedding the veil or exiting the cave, however, whatever metaphor, uh, beaten to death horse, literary device you want to use for this kind of awakening. Uh, I think that at the beginning I was trying to find what the best way to be politically was, like how to get to the very bottom and then become the best political animal that I could, or like to have the truest sense of politics or what have you. So, like a lot of kind of aspie kids like that, I went down the libertarian route. Uh, was pretty heavy in the Austrian economics stuff as a hobbyist again, uh, and unfortunately, that'll be a through line, sort of a dilettante or a hobbyist in a lot of these spheres. But I think it's a great conversation and things to be had. Spent a lot of time learning about economics and political science in school, and then um, went with a crew of people from those spheres into reading Nietzsche pretty deeply. Um, and after that, I suppose the biggest single thing about my life that has happened, the greatest grace, if you will, was my return to the Catholic faith of my childhood, which was kind of stunning, amazing, and uh, um, surprising thing. It was also very humbling because I had been one of these very edgy early teenage atheists who was convinced that it was all rot and all manipulation and smoke and mirrors. And so, a part of me said, okay, to become from an atheist to agnostic is one thing. I dabbled with Taoism for a little while. So to become a Taoist or something Eastern is another thing. And that's all fine and good. Whatever. I can deal with that. But then, to accept that a monotheistic God was provable, it was Thomas, by the way, St. Thomas Aquinas, that got me. To accept that a monotheistic God is is the truth. That made me a little bit uneasy. And then as I kept on deducing and kind of consuming different arguments and praying about it and everything like that, the fact that I was brought back to the exact faith I had as a child was a real punch to the gut. The ego was damaged. So that is the story of how I got here. Now I'm a professional husband and a father.
So this is, you and I are not that different in age, but the phenomenon of new atheism is interesting to me because it's one that I was aware of, but I was kind of too young for it to affect me in a way, right? I was not consuming, any form of intellectual content. So how did you become aware of that as a movement and kind of aware of like the social, I guess, cachet associated with being kind of an atheist? Was that what drew you into it, or were you just kind of naturally disagreeable as a kid?
I think it has more to do with that natural disagreeableness. I think, like you, it was more so kind of uh, this pungent odor in the air. It was more so this kind of very tangible uh, zeitgeist of just rejecting the world I was growing up in. George Bush's America, and um, the fact that the parish environments I was growing up in were not impressive liturgically or spiritually. I had this very clear sense that if I asked anybody in my spiritual life for answers on spiritual questions, that they would be unable to answer them. And I was so convinced of this that I never asked those questions to even give them a chance to answer them. And, a couple of students in my classes had read Dawkins and the others, but I never read any of them. It was just kind of a vibe that I picked up on. And so I use the term new atheist loosely, but at the same time, can we really call it an intellectual movement?
Right, right. Well, there's something interesting, and I'm not the first person to say this, but essentially it seemed like there was this problem almost where because if you actually do engage with the new atheists, they weren't really engaging with the Christian faith. Honestly, they were engaging with kind of like a weak, watered down straw man version of it. But the problem is that that was the same weak, watered down straw man version of it that many American Christians were raised on. So to a certain extent, they were demolishing something that was kind of core to people's lives. It just was not necessarily like the real article, so to speak. And I realize that there's a no true Scotsman route you can take with that one, but it does kind of
Right.
seem like the reason that they were able to make as much headway as they did is because there were a lot of people who just genuinely didn't know that there were answers to those objections. Whereas like if you read it now, and again, I'm not trying to, like, I have the benefit of hindsight, right? You go back to those guys and you're like, well, like this is just a mess. This isn't particularly profound. This isn't particularly like earth shattering. These are issues that were hashed out, 1700, 2000 years ago, plus or minus in some cases, right?
Right,
And
right. And it almost feels like, sorry to interrupt, it feels like a lot of what is talked about in these spheres, the boomer truth regime, or the kind of like the dreamland of the 60s and 70s. The idea that you wake up in the post Manson era, and all of those ideas just seemed crazy in retrospect. Or like, how did we really bite down on this? And I feel like we're coming to grips with those quote unquote thinkers or public intellectuals now in retrospect, with that benefit of hindsight, just to say these maybe weren't the most impressive, and it might have just been something we were all on the same wavelength for that period of time. And I think especially the wound of those years of conflict in Muslim countries, and with kind of the very low level, both evangelical and Catholic language regarding those wars and different assorted cultural war issues around it. It made for really, really easy kindling in terms of effigies. I mean, it was really easy to reject those premises. And now we look back and just just because you killed Jesse James doesn't make you Jesse James, right? So maybe it was good that Hitchens and all those guys took down kind of that zeitgeist of the Bush Blair consensus and the kind of culture war, religious war rhetoric, the New Crusade rhetoric or whatever. But that didn't mean that they were in and of themselves particularly impressive.
Well, and this is a slight tangent, but that's a big part of the reason that I remain so unconvinced by Christian nationalism. It is, to me, Christian nationalism seems to be an attempt to, kind of remake the moral majority, voting bloc into an effective political force. But the problem is, not only is that movement been kind of, or that political force been discredited within living memory, but it's waned in power significantly since it fell apart. It's not like it's growing. It's not like it's getting, more strong, more, socially convincing. And so to me, and again, I'm not trying to just turn this into sniping at other groups of people who I, on the whole, largely agree with. But to me, that's been one of the things that, like, I just can't really wrap my head about that. Like, it seems like that project is, an obviously failed one.
Right. So I think that part of the problem with the Christian nationalism discussion is that there are a couple of things going on. The kind of the baseline argument for it, or kind of, there is an argument for it that follows the lines that you're just describing, where you say we're going to remobilize the moral majority along with kind of the new neoconservative bloc. Maybe hopefully we broke off people like me who are new believers or the new generation of believers, and hopefully the excesses of the left will push everyone far enough to see that we can't just keep living like this, and that there has to be some other way out of this, right? And it takes something from the wisdom of the church's history, in my opinion. And as a Catholic, I can't really reject outright what they're saying in some of their claims. I haven't read the book that they based all this argument on, but just based on kind of the discussions online and the aura of discussion and things like that, part of this that I can't really reject as a Catholic is that the church should have things to do with the state, or that the state can't be kind of atomized from spiritual matters in this way. Aaron McIntyre does a very good job of explaining this, but this is an old idea. For me, reading De Maestro was really important on this topic. That idea that the state, any sovereign will be a teacher of values. The law is a teacher of values. St. Thomas Aquinas again talks about this, that the law is a teacher, and that if you don't think you have a state religion, it's kind of like being at a poker table where nobody is the sucker, because if you can't tell who the sucker is, you're the sucker, right? That whole concept. If you look around and say there's separation of church and state, you're probably being dominated by people that hate you, to be entirely honest.
Well, right. And it's another factor of that kind of, whatever you want to say, like boomer truth, or the legacy of liberalism, right? Which is the idea that something can be quote unquote neutral. So one of the things that I think is happening, and look, I'm not particularly original on this, a lot of people have called it, is that we're essentially seeing a transfer of civic religions, and there always is a civic religion. In some cases it has been Christianity, in some cases it's a literal worship of the state. But in kind of recent history, we kind of have had the state religion of our parents and grandparents, right? Which is kind of like vaguely Christian-esque ideals. George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, and Martin Luther King, right? And those were kind of the saints of the state religion. And now we're very cleanly seeing a transfer to another type of state religion. You may notice that there's a lot of new previously undiscovered historical figures that we all have to know about, and are very important and are being taught in schools.
Yes.
And
Who invented the telescope?
right, yes, yeah, exactly. And with that, I think comes at least in my mind, a clear refutation of the idea that things have ever been neutral. And so if you've accepted the premise of, well, there will be a state religion and someone is going to claim that space, you can never make it a vacuum. And I think that it's a reasonable enough question to say, well, if someone has to be there, why not me?
Right.
But nonetheless, there are other kind of deeper structural problems with that, movement that, while are worth going into, is probably not necessarily, what I brought you on here to discuss.
Sure. I think I align more closely with it, but there just needs to be many caveats. I think that there is definitely a version of it I would reject, and there's a version of it which I would say, Christian nationalism is basically the history of America. And then whatever you're trying to do to make it happen is a sort of revival movement. Um, and and to the extent that a lot of that is true, I could get on board with it. But there are definitely some pitfalls that are just kind of glaring. And yeah, like you said, let's move along. So I guess one of the things that I've been thinking about, and this kind of follows on the heels of that discussion of Christian nationalism, because if the idea of just reveling up the moral majority for uh, one less one last rodeo is kind of dead in the water, then I think that the logical conclusion, whether it's a circulation of elites or whether it's a rise of some sort of Caesar with elite backing, maybe that'll happen, and maybe that'll give ways to participate in politics in a meaningful way again. Maybe there were never really meaningful ways to participate, but I think until that time comes, and if we're in this situation where for now there doesn't seem to be a lot of avenues for normal guys, and I'm speaking as a layperson and as a professional class person, but nobody with too much affluence or anything like that. Just kind of a normal person, I think. Barring all the many gifts and blessings I have to acknowledge. I think that for a lot of people in our spheres and in our circumstances, obviously you should be becoming more worthy every day and striving in your personal and spiritual and professional and other lives. But for a lot of us, there's no real way out, or there's no real action item. And so I think that part of this is really good for the way that the dissident right works online, because I mean, it does kind of get back to the old like GOP saw of like the communist Huns are at the gates and like, please send in your donations to this mailing address, that kind of thing. It definitely works pretty well in that regard to have a lot of people with no real recourse or real action items. But to me, I've just been kind of withdrawing into a sort of quietism, and I've been really comforted by the writings of J.R.R. Tolkien on this question, where he watched the world of his youth and the world that he loved so much kind of disintegrate around him, and ultimately he lost one of the great loves of his life, which was the old mass. For us Catholics, that was a pretty big blow in the middle of the 20th century, and absolutely led to part of the spiritual malaise that we're facing right now. But he said that he's a Christian and a Catholic Christian, and therefore he can't really conceive of history as anything but one long defeat, with some hints or prefigurements of the final victory. And that informed his fiction and his letters, and it informed his philosophy on life. And I don't think that there's necessarily anything particularly evil or defeatist about, well, it's literally defeatist to accept that we're fighting a long defeat. But, the Song of Roland is real, and or at least mythically true. And there's space for heroic rearguard actions in the long defeat. There's space for miraculous victories in the long defeat. As long as we don't let despair creep in, when we recognize that we're not having the outsized impact, or the tide's not really turning the way we're hoping it would. When we saw the Dobbs decision came down in the early summer of the past year, followed by all of those referenda on the abortion question in the midterms, and just how they kind of got blown out of the water. And I think that our elections are secure and safe and fair. But however secure and safe and fair they were, I do kind of take that as a lesson from that time, that, the right answer, the morally upstanding and honorable answer to that question, in my opinion, the only just answer, was not popular. And if we just accept that we're not going to be popular, that the cavalry isn't coming really, and that, then we can turn to our lives and to our spiritual health and to our interpersonal connections, and try to build those things that really do matter, and do the work that's been allotted to us.
You have a lot. You've had a lot to say there, and I agree with it. I think one of the things that I really do take from Tolkien is this incredible sense of entropy, and it's actually something that I found, like, that idea, especially in fiction, just like incredibly interesting. You also see it in Gene Wolfe, right, the science fiction writer, and if this might seem like a dumb kind of like line to draw, but also in the video games made by FromSoft, right, like Dark Souls, things like that, all have this kind of sense of decay to them that I find really interesting.
Sure.
And I think that you're onto something, in the sense that, like, there is, especially from a Christian perspective, there is this sense that the victory is not to be won here and now. That doesn't mean that there won't be victories ever. That doesn't mean that there won't be successes. But the point is not perfection here and now, right? There's kind of like an end stop or a backstop to it.
Mm-hmm.
And so, in a certain sense,
yeah, go ahead.
It kind of, it's odd to me, right, that so many people, and in my conversation with Thomas about Christianity, this came up, right, that traditionally the complaint on excuse me, the complaint against Christians has always been like, oh, they're a little bit cavalier when it comes to things like death, and when it comes to things like civilizational decay, because they do view it as not kind of like the final end. And I think that that's a criticism that I don't agree with, but I can at least see the validity in that. And to me, at least, I think that we have a big problem on the right, and this really comes out of a good place, right? Which is that we're constantly inoculated against the theory of the great man. We're constantly told to essentially, be pod people, to be, to essentially just be like eternal serfs. But the problem is, just by virtue of the way distribution works, not all of us can be aristocrats. Not all of us can be warriors. There's a place for the normal man. And I think that Tolkien had an appreciation for normal people. This is very much what I see, right, in the way that the hobbits are described. And there's very much like a strength in normal people. And so I think that, as right wingers, right, we have to have a role for normal, non-political people. Because, to be honest, most people are not political. They should not be involved in politics. They shouldn't really concern themselves with it. And so, especially in a situation like ours, where you're right, we don't really have anything to do. Like, if I had a button to fix it all, take us to Based World, well, of course I'd push it. But I don't have that option. So what do you do in the meantime? And I think that your point of like, look, like, improve what you can, your personal stuff. I think that that's a really compelling argument.
Right. And, all the necessary qualifiers given, this is a lot easier said than done. Physician, heal thyself. I'm far from a perfect person. And, I saw a meme that was very low effort, but, it's true. It's like, please be patient. God's not done with me yet. And I think about that very frequently. The great spiritual wisdom of the church fathers and the apostles kind of summed up in a stupid cartoon I saw one time. Please be patient. God's not done with me yet. There are these elements of our life that demand a lot of attention, and they're a lot of work, and they're enough for somebody to work at their whole life. And there's a reason that so few people rise above into that great man status. And I think there's a reason that the Christian ideal, especially, and I think that there's a reason that that ethos has created such reverence towards normal people, and normal times, because obviously, like you said, a ticket to base world, it's expensive these days, and if you're looking out for um, every opportunity to get there or every shortcut, you can easily get swindled. Like it's super easy to, buy into the latest hype. Like, could this uh, early 2000s hip hop singer be our ticket? Like, and it's like, what are you talking about? Like at a certain point, we kind of have some self awareness and, telling, the signs of the times, right? There has to be a time where we just kind of mind our own business and put our nose to the grindstone, because otherwise we'll be easy marks. Um, I
Well,
think
and
that
one of the other
another thing.
things
Yeah, go
that
ahead.
I notice in our, and it's less explicitly stated, but it's this idea that, well, if whatever degrades, this institution, this country, this city, well, then my life will be terrible. It'll be hopeless. It'll be the end of it all. This kind of thinking, and I use the phrase like Mad Max, where they assume it's like, oh, like, the US becomes, 49% white, and then it becomes Mad Max. It's the end of the world, it's Fallout. And I mean, to be honest, it's kind of unrealistic, because obviously that's, me exaggerating, but like, you can still live a perfectly fine life in a country that sucks. You don't want to live in a country that sucks. Given the choice, of course, you'd live in the best country you could, or the best version of your country, I should say. But, it's still possible to live, a fulfilling, normal life, even if things, in abstract are going poorly. And again, I'm not saying I wish for this, but I think that there's this conflation between internet reality, political reality, and personal reality. And it's not to say that those, separate spheres are unimportant. But nonetheless, I think that, there's this kind of like catastrophizing that goes on. And it's easy to fall into, right? It's easy to just like look at all of the bad things that are happening. And don't get me wrong, many bad things are happening, and assume that like, oh, this is the end, and I think that that's kind of I don't know, I think that's a limited way to look at it, because yeah, you can lose, things can get worse, but there are many people who have gone through horrible losses, on a civilizational level, right? Where you brought up, Tolkien and Waugh, who saw this, essentially the collapse of a civilization. Augustine is another example. He saw the greatest empire the world's ever seen, crumbling around him. And like, that's real and that's scary. And there's no way around that. That can lead to some serious physical hardship. But to be honest, life goes on. And on a personal level, you can make it. It's all is not lost.
It's a great point, and especially from the Christian perspective, we have these beautiful figures from our patrimony, like Augustine, who did see things as bad as they were, and yet had this undying hope. And Augustine kind of embodies this quietism that I'm talking about in the ideal, like, to tell people the truth that, this. I think that it's funny that we're having like debates every once in a while on right wing Twitter about paganism versus Christianity, because it's just city of God over and over again, where the pagans are accusing the Christians of bringing about the downfall of Western civilization, and the Christians kind of just say like, well, what is Western civilization if not Christianity, baptizing Rome, and things like this. But even scripturally, there's precedent for this, right? So when is it? I'm not sure. I'm not a scripture expert, but it's during the period of the conquest of Israel, or during the period of Judges, that Ruth uh, becomes an Israelite by adoption, right? In the book of Ruth, this holy woman who was a Philistine, if I'm remembering correctly, actually is adopted into Judaic covenant, the Mosaic covenant, through her mother-in-law, and then remarries into that tradition, and then she becomes one of the lines in the lineage of King David. And so while all this turmoil is going on, right, while the Israelites are setting the Holy Land to the sword, essentially, and dashing babes across the rock, as we read in the Psalm, while that's happening, she's having the spiritual awakening and becoming a saint. And then we have another case, King Solomon the Great oversaw the height of ancient Israel, and we don't really think of him in those terms, right? So he did great things, and he was a great man, and he was the wisest of all. But I don't know how doctrinally correct or traditionally correct this is, but my understanding is that Solomon failed. He fell into unholiness and into adultery, and in these different things. He was taken in with the gold of the coasts, right? 666 talents of gold for his soul, and things like this. And that's in the midst of plenty. That's in the midst of greatness. So maybe greatness isn't always what you should seek after, even as it pains us to watch our beloved world kind of decay around us, and especially our loved ones fall into this.
So you brought up, the Christian pagan divide, and that's one of the divides in our circles that I think are actually material. I think a lot of them are kind of fake and gay, but you've written specifically on the urban rural divide, and I like that piece quite a bit. So if you could you kind of explain where you stand on the urban rural divide, and and how you view the conflict?
Yeah. So I I really hate to just do like the kind of persnickety, well, this person said, and then this person said kind of thing. There are figures in the sphere that you can point to who particularly, embody this more than others. And I have a lot of respect for almost all of them, and I really like listening to all of them. But there is what I view as a completely fabricated divide in terms of whether or not you live in a city as being some sort of determining factor over if like over this is not the factor that determines whether you hold the correct things to be true, good, and beautiful. This is not the correct factor that decides whether or not you're on the team or off the team. This is not even really a factor that I honestly I don't think we should care about it that much. The materialists and the class reductionists seem to really emphasize it, but there are poor people in the city. I'm not sure if they know, and there are poor people and rich people in rural and exurban environments. And moreover, I think people's definition of rural is really kind of dicey. So take any cross section of right-wing Twitter or YouTube, whatever you want to do. I'm sorry, but most of them live in city, in like a highway loop around a metropolitan area. This is just a demographic fact of like how the U.S. looks right now. I can't speak for the rest of the globe, but as I understand it, a lot of these same trends apply. I mean, if you say that the only people that matter are yeoman farmers like Cincinnatus or George Washington, who are self-sufficient and virtuous, and they're learned doctors with their own vast libraries, and they can ride into war and finance campaigns on their own and then retire for the good of the republic, then I don't understand what you're talking about other than a kind of imagined scenario. So that's what I have to say for the people that are kind of ruralite supremacists. I think a lot of them live in the suburbs and they don't want to accept it. I think that a lot of them don't understand that, like the poster Enoch Powell mentioned on Twitter, that the highway system would make the Vikings blush with envy. You know, if you really want to go out and raid rural communities, as if you have enough of a kind of base of criminality or subsidized lawlessness, I mean, people like that can absolutely um, endeavor towards those things, or at least I think in the picture of the United States that I see happening in the future, that will become more of a problem. Um, and more so, you know, there are people with a lot of interests and a lot of values, and to reduce everyone to their material state or their class ranking or situation, I think is to do them a sort of severe injury in a moral sense. The idea that we can flatten people in this way and view them in solely where they live. I mean, the example of the Christian life. The apostles were sent to the many cities around the Mediterranean to preach the gospel, and Saint John the Baptist lived in the desert. You know, there are saints and martyrs from every walk of life and in every setting, and the idea that only rural people are based, or that only urban people know enough to implement these plans, I think that both those things are unhelpful flattenings of our human character and ultimately of our dignity. And we should view ourselves as brothers and allies, and there should be more love than this kind of fake distinctions.
Well, I completely agree with you. And again, the problem is that it's just not realistic to have a fully urban or fully rural world. Like, you just cannot do that. You know, cities serve a valuable purpose. And I'm sympathetic to the argument that the many cities in our current world are effectively pointless, right? Like, a lot of these cities were designed to be manufacturing hubs, and in an economy with no manufacturing, we've essentially seen them like waste away to nothing because there's no longer a reason for them to be there, right? I'm sympathetic to that. That makes sense to me. But nonetheless, cities serve a useful function. Even in societies that were much more agrarian than ours will be in the near future, even, right? Have had cities, have had, you know, megalopolises because they serve a valuable function. And again, this idea that, you know, the city mouse and the country mouse like are class antagonists is just moronic to me. And I agree that there is a lot of kind of like trad LARPing, and it comes from a good place. I understand it, but the problem is, like, I think that you're dead on that people live in the suburbs and like to pretend that they're farmers, you know, because they may have some chickens and grow some tomatoes. And I say this as someone who is not a farmer. You know, I've done farm work, but am by no means a farmer. And again, it's one of those things where it's like we're not in a position where we can really like afford to make these kind of like pointless distinctions, because I think that there's a lot of triumphalism from, you know, rural and suburbanites who essentially look at the degraded state of American cities and they're like, "Oh, I don't live in a place like that. That place is bad." And from a certain perspective, they're right. You know, like I went into a hip, fun, liberal city, you know, over the holidays and saw the world's biggest human turd in an elevator. You know, like, that's not something I normally have to interact with in my life. But the mistake is to assume, oh, that is how cities are. You know, that is the inevitable, you know, result of creating a city. And that's not true. I mean, just look at what American cities looked like even in the 50s, you know, which is not that long ago. You know, this isn't like, you know, an unheard of era. There's color photographs of what cities used to look like, places like St. Louis, places like New Orleans. And fair enough, maybe they were more violent than, you know, the middle of, you know, Meridian, Mississippi, or the middle of nowhere, right? But nonetheless, like, the degraded state of cities, they are degraded. You know, they are not inherently bad. And if we're going to kind of remake society into something that works, that will involve, you know, making our cities functional again.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, there are great aesthetic accounts, and this has been done to death by the statue profile picture people. But you know, the walkable cities thing, and these beautiful old photos of middle American and other cities, just like you're saying. I mean, it is a beautiful world, and it's a beautiful country, and it has so much potential, and it has fallen so far from its heights. But the problem with the people that would sow division over this topic in particular that frustrates me is that they never lay out the causal link of how dividing us over this topic will be productive, or how this particular variable determines a bunch of people's attitudes. So there's the phenomenon of the hick lib who lives out in the sticks and is as blue as they come, or red rather, and and there is the phenomenon of the kind of Greer poster, like more right wing than you can really think of, or not to say that that's the case for him, but just the kind of person that like looks around and is like looking behind their shoulder every single moment, and just not having a great time because he lives in the city and he doesn't go along with whatever noun you want to ascribe to our current situation. There's no causal link that people are really expressing. They'll say, well, economic interest drives people towards supporting the Democrats when they are economically interested in being in cities. I mean, I don't really see that, especially with how much these kind of do nothing jobs have become work from home capable. And these, you see drag shows in Boise, Idaho, or whatever it is. And also, I mean, policy is set at the state level. Like, all of us are dealing with a kind of post-modern hellscape whereby there's not even a prospect for another, conflict between the American states, because that's not where the battle lines are drawn. The battle lines are drawn, like Paul Fahrenheit says, in those highway loops around the cities. I mean, the people that live in the suburbs and in the urban areas are going to vote one way, and the people outside of them will vote another way. But I just don't see it. If they live under the same laws, then how could you say that the common denominator of all these laws being the way that they are is that the cities that reside in the state and the people outside the cities in the state both have a vote? I mean, there's more population in the cities, and that doesn't say anything about their economic motivation or their political leanings. There's a potential to get a lot of people revved up about specific issues. It's not in the nature of large populations. I mean,
Well,
maybe it is. Maybe I'm just too naive of a sociologist and
no,
too
I don't think so. Mostly because I agree with you,
unexpert.
obviously. But one of the things that I think that we've seen is one of the methods that the left uses, right, is that, and Carlyle used the phrase, right, the divorce of all against all, I believe. I can't remember. I might have said that wrong. But nonetheless, he's essentially describing this mechanism where, much like breaking an atom, right, you break apart a social bond and use that energy to make political power, right? And that's essentially what the left is, as the force of entropy, right? Turning, social structure into power. And I think that what we've seen is a similar thing happened with, the cities and the, let's just say, ex-urban, suburban or rural populations, right? Where, to be honest, a lot of rural Americans have legitimate grievances, right? That the what limited economic prosperity those people had has been transferred to these big cities, right? We've seen that the manufacturing base, the commodities base that used to prop up these rural communities was sold off to other countries, and the benefit of that, either through direct investment or through management, went to big cities, right? They have a real grievance. So fair enough there, right? The left broke down that bond, which is a necessary bond, and turned it into wealth for them, wealth for their friends, pay off their patrons. But the problem is, much like with men and women, where admittedly both sides have legitimate grievances, you don't get out of that solution by quote unquote winning the fight. You don't get out of the sexual revolution by screwing women over even harder, or in this case, screwing, getting back on the cities. What we need to have is we need to have a good relationship between these two populations because they need each other, right? Like you oftentimes hear this, like, oh, like we could, if you cut the cities off, from the rural communities, they'd starve in 2 days. That's not wrong. That's true. Alternatively, how much of what we do have in rural communities, right, when it comes to materials, when it comes to expertise, when it comes to any of these things, is mitigated through these information centers. The idea that you can win that fight, that we just need to, like, raise all of these cities, make sure that there's not a stone standing on another one, leaning into that fight, I think is a mistake. It's accepting the kind of framing of our enemies who have set this up as a conflict to profit from it.
Right. I think you're totally right. The battle of the sexes is a great example of a similar phenomenon, and please don't confuse me with a feminist, but I mean, I take that as kind of a baseline in these circles. That the idea is not that we will eliminate one side of the gender equation. The idea is that be a synthesis and a peace. And so in the same way that we look at the opioid epidemic in exurban and rural environments in the United States, we don't say that the current state of affairs is the best that those people are capable of, or that this is, it's over. We'll never get this back. We'll never get the beautiful countryside to revive. I think in the same way that we can bemoan the fact that we're all too political and that normal people shouldn't have to care about these kinds of things, and that maybe based world is just a radical depoliticization, so that people don't have to come to some revelation to mind their own business and to better themselves and to care about their family. Maybe the best way that maybe the best outcome possible is that we get rid of the opioid epidemic and we have walkable cities, because people can't walk around killing people with no consequence and worse. And I think that to imagine it as some fixed equation, some zero sum game where the outcome is that we starve everyone to death in the cities, and then what exactly? You come in with your farm implements and you shovel all the bodies into a mass grave and you start over with the trad aesthetic photographs everywhere you look. I mean, I just don't see it. I think that there's better ways and more loving ways to approach the problem, and that is not to deny that there are serious problems in both urban and rural settings. And I think that is basically a manufactured kind of clout chasing maneuver. It's very exhausting to me, that whole debate.
Well, I think that's well said, man. So as we kind of draw this to the close, as we're hitting time, I'm curious, could you remind people where they can find you, and if you want, just kind of add any concluding thoughts to this?
Yeah. So I'm Val. I'm literally Val Kilmer from Michael Mann's 1995 cinematic epic Heat. And you can find me on Twitter at C is not full, with underscores between each word. I'm also writing at the Substack blog, Yet the Sea is Not Full. I take that from Ecclesiastes 1, verse 7, I believe. All the rivers flow into the sea, and yet the sea is not full. One of my favorite books of the Bible, my first love of scripture, even when I was an atheist, and something that is very meaningful to me and very personal. I encourage everybody to check out that content. I'm a hobbyist, as I mentioned, so I've only posted a few times. I'm looking to do a little bit more writing and a little less tweeting in the new year, so please be on the lookout there. I've got a couple things in mind, thinking about a film review for the 1993 film Quiz Show with Ray Fiennes. However, I don't know how to write it without some Thomas 777 or E. Michael Jones tier ethnology that might not fly on Substack. And then what else? Yeah, I just tweet and hang out and live my life and listen to you guys, and it's a fun time. So check it out if you're interested. And thank you very much, Jay, for having me on. I'm a big fan of the show, big fan of your guests, and this was really fun chat. You're a thoughtful guy.
Yeah, thank you so much, man. And I will say I'm always slightly nervous whenever I bring someone live with roughly 4 minutes of behind the scenes chatter and a few DMs, because there's always the part of my mind that's like, oh, what if this guy's a total sped? But this was a pleasant surprise. You're a very articulate guy, and I really enjoyed your work. And I hope to see more to come, because you've got a lot to say, and I feel like this was a really good chat. So thanks for coming on, man.
Thanks, man. We'll have to do it again. I just started a YouTube channel too, to kind of, I didn't know if you needed it for this, but it's on StreamYard. But anyway, maybe I'll think of something there. I don't know. I'm not very adept at these kind of things, but I guess you learn by doing it. So, all right. Well, thanks again for having me.
Yeah, definitely, man. And obviously, Val's links will be down in the description. You guys can check that out if you want. So like I've said before, we're kind of approaching a little bit of a season of change for my show. The amount of content will change. The quality will also change. I've been in the process of deciding a website, and redoing how I'm going to monetize this. I've decided to move away from my previous plan, which was to gate, my backlog for cash, and decided to move to essentially a purely, pay as you want donation model. So I have a, buy a coffee where you can just do a one-time, or subscribe star where you can do a recurring. Basically, this was just too much bother. And I realized that I'd rather have everything up, so people can refer back to whatever they want. But like I said, my links are in the description. The show is available on YouTube, obviously, but also on Apple, Spotify, anywhere you listen to audio-only content. And the new schedule for that is episodes will premiere as audio content every single Tuesday and Thursday at 9 p.m., with additional bonus content as, I talk to more people. But anyway, guys, thanks for coming out. And remember, the light can't last forever. Good night.